Okay, well, welcome to the semifinals of the 2021 Regents Cup competition. And as exhausted as I am by having judged, I can only imagine what all of you are feeling like in this tournament. But this has been amazing for me. In fact, I still teach a class in the evenings, and I'm getting Arizona envy listening to the students that I have today, the students who have been participating. So we have an opportunity to engage in an Oxford-style debate on a topic related to free speech. And the resolution is as follows. Students or faculty members who make other students feel threatened or unsafe should face disciplinary hearings. I will walk everyone through the phases of the debate, which I guess is for public consumption since everybody else has been through this already. And then I'll introduce our judges. There will be 3 rounds in this style of debate. In the first round, you will hear opening statements presented by one student from each team, the affirmative and then the negative team. In the second round, the teams engage in cross-examination. And this is an opportunity for the students to answer questions from the moderator, yours truly. And judges, if you think of questions that you would like to be asked, put them in the chat and I'll try to work them in. And in the final round, one member from each team will present closing statements. At the conclusion of the debate, our judges, who have all received training on how to score Oxford debate and have been doing it all day, will complete the scores of the event. And we will post the results of this round shortly afterwards, and you'll be able to find these on the Regents Cup webpage, regentscup2021.azregents.edu. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the distinguished panel of judges. The Honorable Clint Bollock, Associate Judge of the Arizona Supreme Court. Luann Leonard, former Regent, Arizona Board of Regents, Executive Director of the Hopi Education Endowment Fund. Mark L. Miller, Dean and Ralph W. Bilby Professor of Law at the University of Arizona James E. Rogers College of Law. Jade Richardson, the New Product Development Engineer for W.L. Gore and Associates, and Robert Shibley, the Executive Director of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. Thank you to all the judges, and although I hardly need to say this to you, remember to be objective and unbiased as you listen and score the round today. The score should reflect who you think made the better argument. And very important thing for students, I will give you a 1-minute hand signal when each round is about to wrap up. And actually, I will use this device just for drama. And I will then announce the end of the round. So with that, let me invite the affirmative team to give the first opening statement, and then we will have the negative team. At 6 minutes, I will sound the gong, and at 7 minutes, I will silence the presentation if it's gone on that long. So, Marnie or Naya, who will be the first speaker?
I will be.
Okay. Well, if you're ready, please begin.
My partner and I would like to thank the judges and our opponents for today's debate. Naya and I are proud to affirm the resolution. Students or faculty members who make other students feel threatened or unsafe should face disciplinary hearings. We propose the question, who has the right to dictate when someone is allowed to feel threatened? In the current disciplinary system, a hearing is only held when there are allegations of gross misconduct. Gross misconduct being theft, physical violence, gross negligence, and serious insubordination. However, with a power imbalance implemented throughout schooling, it is essential to grant students the chance to be taken seriously without gross misconduct. Oxford Languages defines threatened as to cause someone or something to be vulnerable or at risk, in danger. This relates relates to another student or faculty not implementing a physical threat, but a mental threat. Negative mental stimulation can impact someone's grades, home life, and typical emotions, meaning that this is a topic that should be taken seriously. While our opponents may argue that taking action when a student feels threatened would negatively impact free speech on campus because threatened is subjective to the victim, it is actually the opposite. Currently, in the Code of Conduct of one of the Big Three Arizona universities, under the Prohibited Conduct List number 21, engaging in discriminatory activities, including harassment and retaliation as prohibited by applicable law or university policy. However, as stands currently, someone who feels that they have been harassed cannot make a claim for disciplinary hearings. This means that in 2013, when UA junior Brother Dean Saxton was harassing women outside of a sexual assault awareness meeting, holding up the sign, "You deserve rape, nothing could be done," he was not removed from campus until he physically assaulted someone. Again, mental anguish means as much as physical. Brother Dean had complained he also encouraged rape to those who are dressed provocatively, get blackout drunk, or is wearing really revealing clothing. I ask you, how does this behavior not condone a disciplinary hearing? 1,143 students were forced to petition to keep Brother Dean off of campus, and their goal was not achieved until he physically assaulted someone, which only led to a disciplinary hearing. My partner and I understand that hate speech is protected under the First Amendment. However, as students and faculty on this campus, we have heard numerous times through public announcements that hate speech is not tolerated. So why then, when brought up by students affected by hate speech, is there no administrative punishment or disciplinary actions allowed to be taken? As disciplinary hearings are already implemented in most schools, there is a solidified foundation for how these conversations would occur. 1, initiation of charges. 2, interim action. 3, review of decision by dean of students. 4, review of university hearing board. 5, hearing board deliberations and recommendations. 6, review and decision by provost. 7, request for review or rehearsing. And then these steps ensure that the correct consequence is delivered to the accused. However, for a student's accusation to be recognized as a threat, whether you personally feel like it is or not, decreases the power imbalance between students and administration. The word harassed is already present in many schools' codes of conduct, meaning being threatened or unsafe. So if these words are already in place, we ask the NEG to explain why they fight to keep a system that forces a set definition of these actions onto faculty and students, limiting their ability to feel endangered through an administrative lens. When considering a student feeling threatened by another student, many times the professor will change seats or ignore the problem in general because they genuinely cannot bring this case higher, as feeling threatened is not penalized by any means. By utilizing even the beginning steps of the disciplinary procedure, it is proving to the accuser that their administration is listening and cares about the problem in a serious manner. When considering a student feeling threatened by faculty, it is crucial to have the support of the administration. Currently, the administration is set up in a way that students feel that they will not be heard because the district is on the side of the faculty. However, when feelings are being accounted for, a level of respect is added for both the students and faculty that make it so that there are no sides, only a hearing to understand what is happening. The recommendations that follow do not have to include termination. It can simply be a discussion on techniques that must change. Making these hearings more accessible to students would also decrease the stigma, instead creating an open dialogue between faculty and students. In fact, creating a culture of safety is highly encouraged by the United States Secret Service and U.S. Department of Education in the Safe School Initiative. This initiative conducted studies of students who had committed violence in schools and created the threat assessments guidelines to stop future acts of violence. One study found most attackers, in fact, did not threaten their target directly, and that students and teachers instead should be aware of other behaviors and communications that are indications of a possible threat. In short, waiting for an actual threat to bring a hearing is waiting until it's too late. The findings underscores the importance of not waiting for a threat before beginning an inquiry. A second finding was most attackers engaged in some behavior prior to the incident and caused others concern. Had there been a route to report these feelings of unsafety, lives could have been saved. It is important to be proactive in order to create a safe schooling environment, rather than brush off concerning incidents that have the potential to spiral into much worse. Many school attacks preventable, and it is important to have disciplinary hearings in place to start the prevention process. For instance, notorious protesters Dean Saxton was not removed from campus after complaints were made against his vulgar remarks. He continued protesting and eventually assaulted a girl in 2016 while protesting, kicking her in the chest while he preached. Had a disciplinary hearing been held for years prior when students felt first felt threatened by his behavior, the vicious attack of a female student may have been prevented. Pine Bush Central School in New York have implemented some of these ideals in the form of progressive discipline as more of a teachable moment, fundamentally propelling a positive approach to these typical negative hearings. Progressive discipline uses incremental interventions to address inappropriate behavior within the ultimate goal of teaching pro-social behavior. It stresses both the accountability and behavioral to a student and faculty. Instead of treating disciplinary actions as a negative, where the most common outcome is immediate termination of the accused, progressive discipline treats it as an open dialogue where the unacceptable behavior is discussed and then a pro-social strategy is formed. This strategy accounts for the nature, severity, and scope of the behavior. Our opponents may mistakenly argue that making disciplinary accommodations for each student's feelings would distract the administration from more important issues. In conclusion, disciplinary hearings for students who feel threatened or unsafe are vital to the safety of our schools. Using the progressive disciplinary model lessens the negative stigma surrounding school hearings and makes students and faculty feel like their voices are being heard. In conclusion, we hope that we are proud to affirm the resolution for the safety of schools, and you should too. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. And now let's turn to the negative, and who will take up that role? Okay, Joshua, please, when you are ready.
Of course. So I'll start now. Before I begin, I just want to thank my opponents, my judges, obviously my partner. I want to congratulate our opponents and I guess being my partner for making it this far. This tournament is a real gem. And I'm glad we all get to have this engaging and productive discussion, specifically for this round on the topic of students or faculty members that make other students feel threatened or unsafe should face disciplinary hearings. So I want to first clarify a couple of issues, which I think are definitely going to come up in this debate, clarify our stance, and then explain to you two major reasons why we oppose this resolution. So first of all, to clarify some definitions, we agree that, for instance, threats ought to be met with disciplinary action. We agree that harassment ought to be met with disciplinary action. But there is a crucial difference between threatening, harassing, discriminatory language and a student feeling threatened. Because this distinction is due to the difference between the intent behind some actions or language and the impact they may have. We can judge actions based on, for instance, harassing actions as harassing, or we can judge threats based on threatening, based on the intent that they carry with them. If they were intended to harass, if they were intended to discriminate, if they were intended to cause some sort of mental or physical harm, then we can classify those as speech that should not be allowed, and we can take appropriate disciplinary action. But there's often speech which is not intended to make someone feel threatened or unsafe, but a person may feel threatened or unsafe. And this is the fundamental disagreement that we have with the affirmation. We agree that disciplinary action should be taken in cases where people make threats, make harassing language, make discriminatory remarks, but that standard of somebody feeling like threatened or unsafe should not be the thing that triggers a disciplinary hearing. Judges, please keep this in mind, as it shows that this resolution is fundamentally flawed due to, keep this in mind, and as we show how this resolution is fundamentally flawed due to its implications for free speech and its use of fundamentally flawed systems. So our first contention is that this standard would impose an undue threat to free speech. So imagine you were discussing, I'll take a class I'm in, for instance. I'm taking a history of American foreign policy right now. Quite a serious class. We get into a lot of deep issues. The professor likes assigning us long texts about specific and bloody CIA interventions that have been taken out throughout the history of the United States. I don't think this is not valuable stuff to discuss. I think this is extremely valuable. Some content in it may make a person feel threatened or unsafe. Some discussion of it may make a person feel threatened or unsafe. But I do not think that because a person feels threatened or unsafe by discussion of a particular topic or remark that was not intended to offend or hurt, that ought to produce disciplinary action. Furthermore, we can't preemptively restrict certain speech, especially with the broad standards that these resolution gives us. The Supreme Court explained in Tinker v. Des Moines that undifferentiated fear or apprehension of disturbance is not enough to overcome the right to freedom of expression. Any word spoken on campus that deviates from the views of another person may start an argument or cause a disturbance. Essentially, what we're saying is that any speech can make possibly somebody feel threatened or unsafe, which is why the standard for determining what speech triggers disciplinary action is fundamentally flawed. Furthermore, a case College Republicans at San Francisco State University v. Reed, a federal district court in California, found that colleges could not enforce a policy requiring students to be civil to one another or a policy prohibiting harassment unless the harassment in question threatened the health and safety of another person. We don't necessarily agree with that case specifically, but we think that in general, the principal idea of putting en masse restrictions or an en masse standard onto speech is fundamentally flawed, and it goes against our freedom of speech. We think this happens in a couple of ways. First is a chilling effect, right? So if one professor is threatened with disciplinary action for saying something that makes another student feel threatened or unsafe, then other professors or other students are going to be less willing to engage in perhaps some controversial discussions because they don't want to go to a disciplinary hearing. And this has been documented on campuses across the US, or at least this chilling effect. We also see that these types of disciplinary hearings and the justifications that they make people feel threatened or unsafe are used to suppress student protests. So at San Francisco State in the 1960s, there were massive protests against advocating for the use of ethnic studies on the campus. It did eventually get violent, but the main ways that the campus was able to suppress these protests was not necessarily through the police, it was through the use of disciplinary hearings, arguing that in calling for changes to be made to the university administration, that you were making the university administration feel threatened or unsafe. We don't think this type of standard should apply, especially at such hot button, especially at such a contentious moment like now, when we think it is more important than ever to have student protests. You know, I love the fact that I can go to a Black Lives Matter or a climate change protest on my campus, and I don't think it's reasonable for the campus to put this undue burden onto us, saying that any speech that we make and that could be interpreted, could make somebody feel threatened or unsafe, needs to be met with discipline. Our second contention is that there are fundamental problems with the disciplinary hearing model. So despite what the affirmative said, it is true that disciplinary hearings are meant to follow aspects of due process, but there are key aspects in which they falter. So for instance, there are no steps to ensure that you can review the evidence which is being used against you, right? The affirmative listed you a procedure that is taking place. I don't know which school they got that from, but generally the Supreme Court has held that you don't need there's no right that a person who is going through a disciplinary hearing has to review the evidence being used against you. We think this illustrates a fundamental difference between the standards that are held in a courtroom, a court of law, versus the standards that are held in disciplinary hearings. Furthermore, disciplinary hearings are run by hearing officers, which usually are members of the university administration or like directly part of the university, and we think that this unduly creates bias against the person being tried. So we can point to a couple of examples. Kathleen Lowry, who was fired in a disciplinary hearing over her language, not particularly controversial, her language on gender, saying it was and the justification was that it was making some students feel unsafe or threatened. Greg Patton was fired from a disciplinary hearing when he used a Chinese word which happened to sound like an English racial slur. He was teaching a class on Chinese business and how to work in Chinese business. And he was fired because that language made students feel threatened or unsafe. What we're trying to show here is that disciplinary hearings are by no means objective, they're by no means fair. Furthermore, they disproportionately can reflect societal biases. According to Professor Travis Riddle, according to the federal data that they cite, shows that a huge disciplinary gap between Black students and white students. Basically, disciplinary action was taken more heavily against Black students because Black students are more perceived to be threats to safety. So for these reasons, because it unduly threatens freedom of speech, because the processes behind it are fundamentally flawed, we are glad to oppose this resolution. Thank you. Moderator, you're muted, I believe.
Sorry, we've now come to the end of the opening statements. And let me throw out a question first for the affirmative, and then we'll see if that will encourage some dialogue. What criteria should be used to determine what is a psychological threat or what constitutes hate speech? And let's start with the affirmative.
So we want to be very clear that, there are certain terms like hate speech that are kind of they're used a lot, but they're kind of very vague and broad in their terms that are used. And so a lot of times that's why things like, speech codes on campus can kind of get a little slippery when it comes to their enforcement. We want to make it very clear that psychological distress and things that we are talking about It depends on person to person, student to student, on what someone feels threatened by. But we also want to enforce that the resolution doesn't explicitly state that making someone feel threatened will inherently deliver any consequences. We want to emphasize that that just means enough to bring it to a hearing to be kind of researched further in the first place.
I want to push back on that notion because I think we give you some clear examples where disciplinary hearing actions are started and then you have undue or irresponsible verdicts. So we give you the example of Kathleen Lowry and Greg Patton, two professors who did not make statements that were wildly threatening of students, but because some students said that they felt disrupted and felt threatened, they were fired. And what we think this reflects is a fundamental, trend within university administrations of wanting problems to go away, right? Especially if you have a large student outcry on it, and this issue is made very public, like it was in the Greg Patton case. I mean, there were petitions, there were articles written demanding he be fired. Again, he was using a Chinese term in a class on Chinese that happened to sound like an English language racial slur. We don't think that's justified. But the fact is the university sided with the students because it's ultimately easier to make the problem go away and to bend to the demands of the majority rather than actively deal with the situation. And we think that represents a lot of the problems behind the disciplinary hearing model in the first place.
Any further response from Affirmative?
Yeah, so that's why our argument is more that increasing of disciplinary hearings will in turn promote more of a civil dialogue between students, faculty. It'll make it so that the end result is not higher punishment or firing or expulsion or anything like that. Making this more of an open dialogue decreases the negative stigma around these hearings and in such makes these issues in turn end up going away. Also, I would like to point out that the set of rulings that we made was actually from the University of Arizona's standard guide, and it does include the steps that we said in our opening.
I think, again, you say that increasing these hearings would lead to open dialogue. And I think that paints a flawed picture of what these hearings look like. It's not like this debate where you have judges and a moderator and four people, openly discussing about an issue. That's not how disciplinary hearings are held. It's usually it's made such that it imitates a legal court process. It's so to say that if we have more number of cases, if we have more people requesting that there should be these hearings, then all the university staff and students would get together in a circle and discuss challenging ideas. That's simply not true. And again, I would like to point to something Josh said in the opening. Even if that were true, we tell you that this process is fundamentally flawed. That usually there's one person appointed by the university, and that may lead to bias because he will more likely rule in favor of the university. He'll more likely they'll more likely rule such that the controversy dies down. So how do you respond to that?
I think I'm having a little problem with understanding you guys' argument fully. So I know that Josh in his opener had said that there are definitely legitimate reasons to make it to a hearing. But then I am also hearing that even when these hearings are held for legitimate reasons, that they're not being, enforced fairly. So to me, it kind of sounds that you guys are anti-disciplinary hearing at all. So then I guess my question would be, how do you support the enforcement of any rules at all if you think disciplinary hearings are overall ineffective, even when there are circumstances that you contended do deserve a hearing?
So we agree that threats and harassment and discrimination ought to be met with disciplinary action. We just disagree with the expansion of this resolution would obviously necessitate an increased number of disciplinary hearings because now you're broadening the standard for what goes to a disciplinary hearing, right? The problem is not we have a problem with the way that the current disciplinary hearing system is set up. And therefore, if you expanded it, you're going to be getting into more problems. We don't have a problem with the idea of enforcing discipline against speech, which is not acceptable on a university. That's not what we're saying. We are saying that the system in place is flawed. And if you expanded it, you're going to be exacerbating those flaws. Oh, you're muted, moderator.
Thank you. We can come back to this issue, but I want to slightly broaden the perspective. What happens when a student action on campus, whether it be the occupation of a building or a particularly exuberant campus demonstration, makes students feel threatened? So let me start with the affirmative, and then we'll go to the negative.
So as our example in the opener, we said the example of Brother Dean. He was holding up signs saying you deserve to be raped. He was constantly on campus, and he was a student, so he was under university affiliation. And around 1,000 students actually had to get checklists of names and deliver that into the university because the university wouldn't listen to them, because under law, the university couldn't do anything until gross conduct was committed, in which 4 years later, when Brother Dean assaulted someone, they finally were able to do something with that. So that's why we did want to broaden the horizon a little bit and say that it shouldn't just be gross conduct to have these disciplinary hearings.
And negative?
One thing I'd like to say is the example they use, I think it doesn't support their case for one reason, and that's Brother Dean is not a student or a faculty member. The resolution quite clearly states that students or faculty members that make other students feel threatened or unsafe should face those hearings. So I'm trying to understand why an outsider, someone who's clearly crazy and is saying insane things on campus, should go through this university process. So I would say that if Brother Dean showed up to my campus and he was saying those things, and if I felt that there was a legitimate threat, like he has, as Marnie mentioned in her opening, he has assaulted people, then I would call 911, because that's an outsider who might hurt me, and he should go through the legal process. Now, responding to the question which the moderator asked, if there was a student demonstration, right, which was exceptional in the sense that it could lead to violence, then sure. If there was evidence to prove that that person demonstrating actually might hurt someone, might assault someone for the sake of that demonstration, then sure, that person should go through a hearing. But then I don't think this standard should be imposed for all kinds of demonstrations. I think that would be really problematic, because then you'd have just peaceful protesters and someone gets, so maybe there's a BLM protest and someone feels threatened because of that, even though it's people walking and holding signs, and you'll have unnecessary hearings which are unjustified.
I do just want to note, Marnie had mentioned before she brought it up, Brother Dean was a student at the U of A, so I know that you were contending that like outsiders, you can't do anything about it, you would call the police, but the university did have a special interest because he was a student on campus.
We think that like we can go back and I apologize for our team like misinterpreting that, but we think that the broader principle is what's at stake here, right? Because we cite evidence in the past of universities using these types of disciplinary hearings to constrict protest, especially when protest directly goes after the decision of administration, such as to not offer specific classes, to not hire specific professors, to fire specific professors. That was used at San Francisco State in the 1960s. But we think regardless of Brother Dean's actions, like that principle should not be used, especially when universities have an interest in making certain protest movements go away. So in the 60s at SF State, you saw these, even when the disciplinary hearings weren't actually enforced, a lot of them were found, were kind of like they sided with the student. But the fact that students had to go to these disciplinary hearings en masse, it completely shut down the protest. Right, because they felt like they couldn't, because they were under review, basically, they felt like they couldn't take certain actions or say certain things for fear of their financial aid going away or their campus jobs going away. And so we really push back on the notion that this disciplinary hearing is used for just benevolent means. The disciplinary hearing is a tool of people in power, and people in power often have some motivations which are not too savory. Oh, you're muted again.
Leave it on now. I thought I was contributing background noise. Could either the affirmative or the negative bring to bear the evidence of litigation and court decisions on the results of disciplinary hearings regarding students?
So yeah, we cited some Supreme Court precedent. Tinker v. Des Moines refers to general disturbances on campus, and it expressly held that just because an argument or something may lead to a disturbance or could possibly lead to a disturbance, that is not grounds to implement disciplinary action or censor that speech. Further Supreme Court precedent has in College Republicans at SF State v. Reed has narrowed that even further, arguing that restrictions on civility might unduly restrict speech because some speech that is classified under that may not harm, like it may not constitute an imminent danger. And we can go back and forth about whether like specific codes over harassment or civility are properly enforced or properly implemented, but we think that the fundamental legal principle is still the same, right? The university is a public forum or is a public place. People in the university have a public stake in making sure that there's public discourse going on there. There's a free, fair exchange of ideas. And when you limit that, even in relatively minor ways like this procedure, you're inherently opening the door to further and further restrictions of speech, which the Supreme Court has roundly condemned.
So for the case of Jeffries v. Harleston showcases the university's ability to enforce punishments. The City College in New York was justified in its removal of a professor as head of their department because of the professor's anti-Semitic speech, likely was to having a disturbing effect on campus. On the side of the affirmative, there is a legal constitutional ground to foster a safer, less threatening environment. And I know that Michael asked for student cases, and this is a faculty case. However, the general idea still stands.
Just deepening that, what does affirmative and negative think about the role of the bias response teams that are popular on a number of campuses? Do these have a wholesome effect on campus or not?
Yeah, absolutely. We're not trying to pretend that campuses aren't biased or there's a bias. We know that is a real struggle, especially right now. However, if anything, that sets this resolution in the present and anything that we can do to push that forward and help fix the bias. So findings from the 2016 from the National Survey of Student Engagement suggest that 1 in 7 Black students feel physically unsafe on college campuses. Right now, there is a bias saying they feel physically unsafe, which means they cannot in turn declare anything to the administration that would lead to a disciplinary hearing. Opening up these hearings as more as a dialogue could potentially end up fixing this bias.
Negative?
Responding to the bias, we think that the university is more likely to rule in its favor and make sure that the outcome is such that the controversy, just dies down, so that it benefits them. Or sometimes they'll be subject to public pressure if there's students who have started petitions against a professor. Then they'll feel the pressure from the students and they'll act in their favor. I actually have a question for the neg. So you say that, so are you proposing that not only should these hearings be expanded for people who feel threatened, but that they should be changed such that they have like an open dialogue thing, like a component of open dialogue in them? So are you also advocating for that?
We're just contending that that could be a future possibility. As Marnie had stated before, there's a comprehensive process to get to hearings that we want to open up students' availability to, specifically when citing that, the United States Secret Service and Board of Education have said that these, open dialogues and accessibility to hearings on campus, can potentially lead to decreasing violence on campus. So we're very much in favor as a possibility, but it's mostly just opening up these hearings to be brought in the first place. And that may be a motive that universities use, but it also may not.
Well, I think this really highlights, I would completely agree, and based on the evidence you cite, dialogue is clearly good for promoting free expression, free speech, development of ideas on campus. But these disciplinary hearings don't have any guarantee of dialogue. And too often there is an explicit rejection of dialogue. Look at the example of Greg Patton, which we cited, right? The lack of correct or proper disciplinary hearing procedures meant he couldn't really explain himself, right? He couldn't explain his circumstances. And the university, in its bias, sided against him because they frankly didn't want to have to deal with this problem of a university professor staying on when a bunch of students said he made them feel unsafe. Again, for using a Chinese term that sounded like an American racial slur. So that's not an example of dialogue happening, right? There's no meeting of the minds there. There's no meeting of ideas. There's no saying, hey, this is the context behind the explanation. There is a group of people saying, we feel unsafe, we feel threatened. And this is not to say that they don't feel unsafe or unthreatened, but it's to say that sole metric is what initiated disciplinary proceedings and ultimately got him suspended from teaching that specific class. So what we're saying is that universities have a lot to do in terms of recognizing their own bias, and they can make those changes without unduly cracking down on freedom of speech. Furthermore, in response to the bias team question, so there's the question of bias on the university side, and then there's the question of bias within the classroom. So bias of the individual professors against certain students, or bias of the faculty when it's prosecuting certain students. We agree with the overall goal of bias teams in that they attempt to give professors bias trainings, attempt to show hey, this is, perhaps your language is not as updated, perhaps your language is not as sufficient for dealing with a diverse audience. We completely agree with those tactics. However, we like that those bias teams do not have disciplinary power. What we would like to see is a decrease in bias of the universities, especially when you see these disciplinary hearings disproportionately used against African-American males, because feelings of unsafety, of threat are societally associated with African-American men.
Let me segue to one more question, unless the teams would like to introduce another one of their own. But absent that, if, and I'm putting this in the conditional, or I should put it this way, to what extent should civility be a priority on campus? And if there is an argument that it should be a priority of some rank, how is it best fostered?
So, or do you want to go for it, Marnie?
Oh, no, you guys are good.
Okay. So we all agree civility is good. Civility is especially good when you're throwing around very contentious, very heated ideas. But civility, we recognize, is often used as a Trojan horse for more apparent restrictions of speech. So while we of course like civility, we prefer implementation of civility that does not directly violate somebody's freedom of speech. And we've already seen, due to Supreme Court precedent, that creating this broad standard for what speech can be prosecuted basically through the university system is not keeping in line with civility, right? Because the purpose of civility is to restrain a already productive and already engaging discussion. But when you create that chilling effect, when you say any speech which makes somebody feel unthreatened or unsafe, then you are inherently decreasing the productivity that the discussion could have. You're inherently decreasing the ground that discussion could cover. So civility ultimately it loses its weight because there's nothing behind it. There's no real discussion behind it that's creating the need for civility.
I would have to say that this resolution is centered around civility being introduced as the key component in these disciplinary hearings. I think that having civility as the goal on campus would achieve what the AF is arguing for, which is, again, these open dialogues. I think that not only would that negate the negative stigma that already exists, but it would promote an all-encompassing conversation. It means that when one person feels threatened, they feel like the campus will now listen to them. And that in turn would decrease the overall eventually, or at least that is the goal of these hearings to begin with. Also, we have multiple times brought up that hate speech and slurs are not gross misconduct, so they are allowed on campus. So making civility the goal of this and making it so that feeling threatened or harassed would then lead to hearings that wouldn't be allowed on campus anymore.
But I think that like I agree, like, yes, for instance, like I'm failing to see how like slurs are not already prosecuted, like, or shown to like given disciplinary action by universities. Like, I don't think that universities, like, regardless of this resolution, are really lenient in terms of the use of racial slurs by their professors. I mean, that deals with an issue of employee conduct, less so an issue of your speech making somebody feel threatened or unsafe. I mean, yes, it does those things, but it's also the fact that the university doesn't want its employees using racial slurs. Yeah, go for it.
Let me just clarify a point. What is the appropriate role of punishment in fostering civility on campus?
I would say that whenever punishment is delivered, whether it be for a disciplinary hearing or any other kind of legal case, the idea there is twofold. One, that the punished doesn't act in the same way again, and the second is that the punished maybe gets a chance to reform themselves. And again, this will depend on the crime, and then this will be extremely different on campus. Does that answer your question, or am I missing a point?
I have no opinion.
What we think, I think, to clarify what Akash is saying, right, is like, we don't even disagree with the university like pushing and prodding in certain directions for the use of threatening or unsafe speech to be restricted. We do disagree with the use, the blatant use of the disciplinary hearing model as the default, right? Because the disciplinary hearing model, at the end of the day, because if you are found guilty, or guilty in this case, there is a punishment, right? And like we mentioned, universities have a bias towards making their problems go away. So for instance, in the examples of the professors we cite, the universities didn't want this problem to become larger than it was, to draw more student attention, to draw more controversy to themselves. So the punishment was maximum. The person was completely blocked from taking the course, or the professor was fired in the case of Kathleen Lowry. We don't think that's how you use punishment and discipline to ensure civility. That's the complete opposite of that.
I think one thing that we really want to emphasize is that me and Marnie have, continued to say that hearings and consequences are two different things. Hearings may lead to consequences, but hearings do not inherently mean consequences will be given. And so while our opponents time after time are saying that the threat of consequences means that we should have no disciplinary hearings because they are flawed, we argue that disciplinary hearings, they provide for due process for both sides to be heard, whereas if you strip disciplinary hearings, what is the alternative? Because with no hearings of both sides, as the name hearing suggests, that would mean that there's no due process and just consequences are implicated with no real, trial, as they said, which they're modeled after. We're arguing that you need the hearings, even as much as they may say that they're ineffective or biased, because otherwise neither side is objectively heard, and schools can just implement consequences left and right without due process.
I don't think we are arguing for getting rid of the disciplinary hearings. We are simply saying they should not be expanded to cases where students feel threatened. So I think that's not true. So we do think that this process should exist, but it should not be expanded to generally feeling threatened.
Yeah, and we specifically, like, as part of our case, we imply that like the disciplinary hearing model should be changed overall. We don't have the time to get into like how disciplinary hearings should be enforced for threats and things like that. Perhaps there can be reforms made to ensure that there is more due process, that there's more careful evaluation of evidence, there's more, there's less partiality. But insofar as you take an already flawed system and try to amplify it and try to put it for issues that are frankly spurious and very vaguely defined, then you're going to be seeing an inflammation of those issues.
Let me, if I may ask a even more defining question. On some campuses, a representative from the campus police will sit on a bias response team. Even if that team is not given disciplinary authority, there will be a member of the campus police. Do the teams feel that this is a good idea, a bad idea, or an indifferent idea?
Go for it, Marnie. We've been answering a lot of questions.
I think that in beginning this change to what we're discussing, I think that this, and not that it's an indifferent idea, but I don't think that it is no longer necessary. And back, just to refocus a little bit for the judges, back to your initial question, this whole punishment idea is what we are trying to solve. There will be a decrease in vast punishment when civility is involved. There is punishment when found guilty, like Josh had discussed. However, this is creating a safe space where students are no longer afraid to self-censor their own feelings. We are not saying that no one will be severely punished. However, there's less a chance of punishment and more a chance of refocusing. Again, leading back to this policeman on the board, when you are no longer resulting in mass punishment, that policeman is no longer necessary to be there.
Okay. So to answer the moderator's question, I think Josh would agree that first, like it's having policemen, I think it's slightly different from the resolution, but I think the underlying assumption there is that the policeman is a fair arbiter, that when he's present in the bias training, that things will go fairly, and all the issues will be brought up, and the conversation or the knowledge being imparted will be fair, and then we can ask questions about, well, are police trained properly, and that's like a entire separate debate. So at least personally, I'm indifferent to having police in those bias trainings, and I'll have to look into the impacts of taking that step.
Okay, well, we are coming to that moment of the closing statements. Now, would either team like to have a half minute or so to respond to something that's been said during this wonderful exchange?
I think we're okay.
No, okay. Well, in that case, we will start with the affirmative, 4 to 5 minutes. And once again, I will use my device at 4 and then more loudly at 5. So let's go with the affirmative closing statement, please.
Okay. My partner Marnie and I would like to bring back the focus to the overall mission of disciplinary hearings, the safety and comfort of faculty and students. Denying students the ability to express when they feel threatened or unsafe creates a negative power dynamic between the administration and the students. Whereas with progressive disciplinary actions, an open dialogue is created between all three parties, eventually leading to decreased gross misconduct and increased transparency. In an era where mass shootings occur on average every 2 weeks, it's important not to limit what entails threatening behavior before it's too late. The neg will try and paint us as anti-free speech, when in reality, they're prioritizing targeted hate speech over campus safety. We have legal precedent upholding the legality of the resolution we offer, and universities already hold hearings with specific guidelines, therefore they are more than capable. My partner Marnie mentioned in her opener, gross misconduct cases are the only ways to reach hearings currently, and this resolution allows for people who feel threatened, say maybe because of slurs or offensive language, to bring cases for hearings. As Josh had mentioned, students may fear being met with discipline if these hearings are broadened. However, we want to remind you that hearing does not inherently equate discipline. There's comprehensive hearing process in place that provides for due process where students can be served if ultimately decided. Schools have a responsibility to hold those who directly represent the school accountable for behaviors that make students feel unsafe. I know you've heard a lot of new information over this past hour, and you might have come into this with your mind made up against us, or maybe you're still on the fence. But if you forget most of this argument, the one thing I want to remind you to take away is that affirming the resolution is allowing for measures that prevent future campus violence. This inherently furthers student comfort and safety, which in turn allows for a more beneficial learning environment. We do not change the status quo. We are allowing for all students who are currently feeling safe on their campuses right now stay silenced. For these reasons, Marty and I are proud to affirm the resolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And for the negative, please.
Yes, so the first thing I'll say, based on the closing that Naya just gave, I think we both agree on, both the teams agree on what the consequences should be, or that is, we both want students and faculty to be safe. We both want that there should be a good learning environment. We simply think that the solutions they propose fail to help us get to that world. So the first thing I'd like to say, which our opposition brought up, is they say that these hearings have a solidified foundation, that there's a due process, and the other word which was used in the closing was that there's specific guidelines. And yes, we agree that there's a step-by-step process which has been laid down for these hearings, but we also point that the whole process is unfair because number one, the hearing officers are simply appointed by the university. There's chance of bias. They'll rule in favor of the university. I think we covered this both in the opening and the crossing. We fail to see how imposing these disciplinary hearings for all kinds of cases where anyone feels threatened would lead to a safer campus environment. The second thing, which I really found interesting throughout the debate, is they proposed that one of the possible solutions would be to change the hearing process such that it's more like an open dialogue. So implicitly, they are agreeing with us that the existing process is unfair, that there's something wrong with the existing process. That's why they proposed this solution. I just see that my laptop has 5% left, so I'm going to go through this really quickly and turn my brightness down. So they implicitly agree with us that this process should be changed, and which brings me to the second point we were making, that again, this is an unfair process, number one. Number two, it might prohibit free speech on campus. That's why it's not a good idea to expand these disciplinary hearings whenever any student or faculty feels threatened by someone else's speech. I think the last thing I'd like to say is put yourself in the shoes of a college student, right? You have been through 12 years of high school, and then you are excited to take college classes. You're excited to learn new things. You have a major, and you feel like a big person. You're stepping into adulthood, and then it just so happens that there's a book which is being discussed in a class, and someone finds that offensive, and then there's a hearing, and then that book is never taught. I think you would not appreciate that kind of an environment where anything, if any kind of book, even set in the proper context, causes offense, leads to disciplinary hearings, because the result of these hearings would be, even if the professor isn't disciplined, like if students complain about that book like every month or every week, then that professor is going to think, well, why would I bother with these hearings? I can just stop teaching this book, and then I wouldn't have to face this legal process. I wouldn't have to go through this go through this extra thing. So I think the world where you have a safe learning environment, doesn't need expansion of this hearing process for every speech which is potentially threatening, and we provide legal backing for that, and we provide several examples such as Greg Patton and those which were never addressed. I hope that wraps up the negatives viewpoint when it comes to the inefficacy of disciplinary hearings and the threat it poses to free speech. So thank you so much.
Well, with that, applause for really wonderful presentations and great exchange. Judges, I now turn to you to complete the forms on Yatley. And whatever the outcome of this debate, I just want to say how impressive all of you are, and what a wonderful thing you're contributing to campus life by having this kind of dialogue.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you folks taking the time out of your day to engage as well.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank
Josh,
you.
you feel
Yeah, you too.
Bye.